Hi, Emily.
Hello,
Thanks for being here today. So,
you're very welcome. Thanks for having me.
all right. So I just changed the screen over to you, so it's all yours.
Okay, are you seeing my screen?
Yes, thank you.
Awesome,
Looks good.
great. Thanks so much. All right, well, welcome everybody, and thank you for attending. If you're anything like me, you are working as a cataloger and perhaps in a state of confusion about sort of the time of transition we're in as far as cataloging standards go at the moment. We've relatively recently, within the last couple of years, adopted RDA, the new cataloging rules, and there's more change on the horizon as we look towards our encoding standards. MARC, the machine-readable cataloging, has been our standard for a long, long time that allows computers to read and transform our catalog records to make something useful out of them for our patrons. But we are on the horizon where we can see the replacement for MARC called BIBFRAME. And so that's what I'm going to talk about today. My plan is for this webinar to be a very, very basic introduction to kind of the whys and hows of BibFrame, point you in the direction of some libraries who are experimenting with BibFrame, so you can maybe start to get an idea of what this would look like in the real world of cataloging. And so this is just going to be a very general introduction to what is supposedly coming after MARC. So let's go ahead and jump in. So what is BibFrame? BibFrame is not quite an acronym, I guess, but an abbreviation for the Bibliographic Framework Initiative, which is an undertaking of the Library of Congress. So you'll see they always put it in all caps, even though it's not technically an abbreviation. I'm not sure why. But it is a project, like I said, started by the Library of Congress, and here's a quote from some of their statements about what it is. It's an undertaking to better accommodate future needs of the library community, basically recognizing that MARC 21 exchange format is no longer where we want to be as far as computer encoding for our library catalogs, and they would like to transition to a more web-based linked data standards for our library data. And so when this was announced, the Library of Congress was working with a consulting firm called Zafira. They have since, I believe, ended their partnership, and they're each working on things separately, but they worked together to get BibFrame off the ground and developed a linked data model, vocabulary, and tools and services for this. So basically, the things I wanted to highlight here is that we're moving away from MARC 21 and moving towards a linked data model of library data. And so to kind of understand what that transition means, I think it's first important to kind of wrap our heads around what is wrong with MARC. You know, we've been using MARC since the 1960s, and it's worked pretty well for libraries. So why are we talking about moving away from it? Well, for one thing, it's meant for printing catalog cards. Yes, MARC has been used for a very long time in order to make our catalog records readable in OPACs, online public access catalogs, but it was originally designed for the Library of Congress to print copies of catalog cards, which they could then distribute to libraries across the country. And so that just tells you a little bit about the datedness of the technology. It's not even, you know, it's not taking into account even our computerized catalogs. It's not based on RDA, resource description and access, the newest catalog rules. It's really a technology based in an older time. Another issue with MARC is that it's only used by libraries. When we first started using MARC, which was in the 1960s, it was developed by a woman named Henriette Avram who worked at the Library of Congress, and it was very revolutionary at the time. It was a big deal as far as computer science went. Libraries were kind of cutting edge, but now computer scientists and web people outside of libraries have kind of developed way beyond MARC, and we're the only ones who use it, and that sort of keeps our data in silos, to use, I know has become kind of a buzzword about talk about silos in the library world, but it's true. We're the only ones using MARC, and so if we want to work with other sources of data out there on the web, it's kind of limiting to be stuck using MARC. When it comes to encoding, one thing about MARC that's kind of a problem is that it's not very specific. And, everything is broken down into fields and subfields, but you have fields that can be used for more than one thing, or more than one field that can be used for the same thing. Information is duplicated in the variable fields and the fixed fields, for example. Or to go the opposite way, for example, the 245 field, your subfield B, could mean a number of different things. For example, in this one, it's a subtitle. And you only know that because of the punctuation that comes before it, which is not a way that programmers normally understand things like this. So you want to be able to tell that subfield B should be subfield B. On the other hand, it could be a parallel title if you have the title proper in one language and the parallel title in another language. And again, you only know this because the equal sign instead of the colon before subfield B. So not all of the meaning and encoding is contained within the codes and subfields themselves. A lot of it depends on the punctuation, which is really confusing than today's computer science environment, really. And here's another example of one that doesn't have a subfield B at all. It's totally not here. It's skipped, or actually, I'm sorry, here's another one. It does have it. It's in a different, but it has a parallel title within the subtitle. And so if you were, for example, setting up some kind of script to find all of the titles, you might miss this second part, because if you were just trying to find the subtitles in subfield B, you wouldn't be able to find that parallel title. So MARC is not the most specific way of encoding things, and it doesn't function the way a lot of computer scientists are used to dealing with programming. An article that really drove this home for me, it's a few years old now, I think, yeah, 2010, but this is where I kind of got those 245B examples from. It's called Interpreting MARC, Where's the Bibliographic Data? And it's written from the perspective of a programmer and more of a systems librarian type of perspective, and how he's sort of had to learn the quirks of MARC, and it really illustrates the reasons why MARC does not function like how most current modern web standards work. And so I would highly recommend that as an interesting read. I will just pause a moment here to say that I will be sending my slides to Louise afterwards, and they will be made available to you. So by no means feel like you have to scramble to write down these URLs that I'm throwing at you. You will have the slides after the. So MARC is not very specific. That is one issue with MARC. And another issue is just, again, sort of taking into account the way that the general World Wide Web is moving, and sources of information and data on the web are moving, and we need data instead of records, meaning we want the things in our catalog to be broken down into smaller pieces of information. Our records work really well as sort of monolithic chunks where a person can stare at them and say, oh, the title is Tale of Two Cities, and the author is Charles Dickens, and that means that Charles Dickens wrote this book, and it's great for a human reader who can sit there and look at it, but computers don't understand any of that. And when we talk about moving to a linked data environment, the ideas behind that, as I discussed in my last presentation for Rails, is that you break the information down into smaller discrete pieces of data, and then those individual pieces of data can be linked, and these whole webs of meaning that go beyond even your own personal or your institution's repository of data, and it can be linked to other things out there on the web and allow people to discover new resources. It really depends on having chunks of data instead of records. And so that's why we're moving away from MARC records and into a linked data environment, where we'll think less about the records we're creating and more about the data we're creating. So I wanted to kind of step back and give a sort of a timeline of what we've been doing, what the library community has been doing with BIBFRAME up until this point. It's relatively new. So just over 4 years or so, I guess. The Bibliographic Framework Initiative was announced by the Library of Congress in May of 2011. And their framework plan was published in October of 2011. If you're familiar at all with sort of the timeline of development of RDA, the resource description and access cataloging rules. When those rules were released, they were tested by the national libraries and some of their partners, and this was going on in 2010, I believe, and their results were announced in 2011, and one of their stipulations was that if RDA was going to be adopted, there would need to be some kind of credible work shown on a replacement for MARC. They just really didn't feel like RDA was showcased really well in MARC. We were changing a lot of things for RDA that still kind of left us stuck in our traditional way of doing things when it's constrained by a MARC record. And so they really pushed for something to replace MARC. And so these announcements in 2011 were a reflection of that. The Library of Congress said we are moving away from MARC and we are working toward a linked data model for bibliographic data. And the BIBFRAME, draft model and primer was published in November of 2012. So another year later past that, and since then it's just been under development. The Library of Congress is still doing their own thing, and Zafira has kind of broken off, and they're doing their own version of BIBFRAME as well. And so everything is really in flux, but it's just sort of working from that draft model that was published in 2012. So at this point, before I get into more of the specifics of BIBFRAME, I want to kind of take a step back and just talk a little bit about what linked data is. I've been throwing that term out there a lot, and if you attended my webinar last month, you saw a much more detailed explanation, but I do want to stop for this point either as an introduction for people who are not familiar with the topic or a refresher for people who have learned about it before. The Wikipedia definition of linked data says that it's a method of publishing structured data so that it can be interlinked and become more useful. It talks about the web technologies that it uses, but other than the fact that it's structured data and interlinked, the really important part I think about this definition is that it says that the information on the web can be read automatically by computers, not just by humans. And so kind of going back to what I was saying about how we need data instead of records, linked data in general, outside the library world, kind of moves away from a web of documents or a web of resources and moves toward a web of data. So right now, when you talk about standard HTML, hypertext markup language web pages, they are linked. You might say, well, what's the deal with linked data? We have links now, and they are, but they're linked kind of monolithically from one resource to another, and we don't really have any idea about why, and there's no meaning encoded in the links. On the other hand, in a linked data world, individual pieces of data are linked together, and those arrows that are showing the relationships, they actually do have relationships encoded within the computer in a way that a computer can understand. So, this is an example of a standard HTML web page, and those H1 and P tags, they don't really tell the computer a whole lot about what is contained in the heading or the paragraph. They just tell it how to display the information. The only thing that the H1 tag tells the computer is that this is a heading and therefore it should be bold and it should be a little bit bigger than the paragraph text. It doesn't say anything about what the relationship is or what the information inside those tags is. On the other hand, here's an example of RDF, which stands for Resource Description Framework. It's encoded in XML, which is extensible markup language, and is one of several different options for expressing RDF. And don't worry, I'm not going to throw too much more of this at you to hurt your eyes, but I just wanted to see, even from just taking a look for a second, you can see how much more rich this is in terms of the information that is encoded. The resource that's being described is up here at the top, and then these tags tell you that this piece of information is the artist that created this album. For this resource is a particular album. It was produced in the United States by Columbia, which is the company, and the price, and the year, etc., etc. So the computer encoding itself allows the computer to understand what the meanings of all these pieces of information are. And then other than having computer-based, computer-readable meaning, the other main part about linked data is that relationships are key. we as human readers of information are used to connecting pieces of information based on their context. To use the example from library catalogs I talked about before, we see title A Christmas Carol, author Charles Dickens, and we can assume that Charles Dickens is the author of a book called A Christmas Carol. Computers don't understand that automatically, and so linked data makes these relationships explicit. When you're hearing about linked data or about BibFrame, you'll probably hear the term RDF triples. The statements that are expressed by RDF are called triples because they have three parts: subjects, predicates, and objects, kind of like sentences. And so the entities here are A Christmas Carol and Charles Dickens, and has author is the predicate or the relationship. And that's what really allows for this this illustration that I showed you before. You start with a simple statement, a triple like that, and you can expand to a whole web of linked relationships. And to expand a little bit on a snippet of RDF similar to the one I showed you before, the strength in linked data, the one I showed you before had a bunch of encoded information, but it was all supplied by the person who was writing this code. The strength of excuse me, linked data is to bring in information from other sources, like the Dublin Core vocabulary that is referenced up here. And so that is how the links happen in linked data. And that is what BibFrame would be building on. So now I'm going to shift gears a little bit away from the generalities of linked data and talk a bit about the conceptual model that is laid out by BibFrame. And more information about BibFrame can be found at that bibframe.org website. That the URL is there on your screen. And that is where I'm getting this information from, so you can definitely explore the model in more detail by reading at bibframe.org. The BibFrame model breaks down the information in our catalogs to these core classes called work, instance, authority, and annotation. For those of you who are familiar with RDA and their different entities, this is very similar to some of the entities that are laid out within RDA, and I'll be pointing out those differences, similarities and differences as we go along. Here is kind of one of the diagrams of laying out these basic core classes. When it comes to talking about the things that we're actually going to be cataloging in our catalogs, probably the distinctions to be made are between work and instance. And if you're familiar with RDA's WEMI, work, expression, manifestation, and item, work and expression are kind of embodied, I think, in the BibFrame work. Those are the more abstract content type, I suppose, attributes that apply to pretty much any physical representation of a particular something that you're cataloging. So they're the more abstract things that could apply to basically, they don't embody the physical characteristics, whereas the instance is more of the thing that you would actually hold in your hand, the more of the attributes that deal with either manifestation or item when we're talking about RDA's different entities. And so let me talk a little bit more about each of these core classes in BibFrame's model. The work is the resource reflecting a conceptual essence of the cataloging resource. And that was just that's the official definition of what I was just explaining before. Again, it's the more abstract concept. To go back to our Tale of Two Cities example, a print version of Tale of Two Cities, a print one in English, a print one in Spanish, an audiobook version, an ebook version, those would all be the same work. It doesn't really matter at all what the physical representation of it is. It's the more abstract representation of the same content in any particular physical carrier. Whereas the instance is the resource reflecting an individual material embodiment of the work. So it's the manifestation and item type of information. Information about the publisher, for example, would be relating to the instance. Let me go back to that diagram for a little bit. Yeah, the format that it's in, the publisher, the place where it was published, those would all relate to the instance, whereas things that would relate to any kind of instance, so the subject of a particular work or the creator of a particular work, those would go with the higher level, the more abstract content representation of work. So those are kind of parallel to things that are occurring in RDA. Ones that are probably a little bit different, authority. The definition of that from BibFrame is a resource reflecting key authority concepts that have defined relationships reflected in the work and instance. So, so the creator's name example would be an authority. And then pretty much anything else that you use to describe a BibFrame resource is called an annotation, which I always thought was kind of an interesting term to use, because to me annotation seems to imply that it's something extra, whereas really an annotation, in the way BibFrame talks about it, is, you know, sort of an attribute, I guess. How I would think of it, I think that's, you know, the RDA speak for it would be an attribute. Anything additional information about your BibFrame resource is called an annotation in BibFrame. So I've been kind of alluding to this throughout the presentation, but I wanted to stop for a minute and talk more explicitly about what the relationship is between BibFrame, so the computer encoding standard that we're moving towards, perhaps after MARC, and RDA, Resource Description Access, the current cataloging code that tells us how to create the information in our records. I know that traditionally, you know, these two things, the rules and sort of the encoding wrapper that goes around it, has been very intertwined. People, you know, would speak of AACR2 and MARC as, you know, kind of would use them interchangeably, even though they're technically different things. And so it's kind of interesting to see how the rules and the encoding standard are going to relate to each other in this new cataloging world. The Library of Congress BibFrame website, in their FAQ section, they say RDA is an important source of elements in the vocabulary for BibFrame, even though it generally aims to be independent of any particular set of cataloging rules. So technically, BibFrame is designed to be used with anything. You could use other standards other than RDA and still, you know, create a valid BibFrame set of data, I suppose. And so that's why you'll see things like work and instance instead of work, expression, manifestation, and item. It's not meant to necessarily be a one-on-one match with RDA. It's supposed to be more widely applicable than that to a variety of metadata content standards out there, I suppose. And so here's kind of a mapping of some of the basic, the RDA WEMI, work, expression, manifestation, and item, and then boiling that down to the BibFrame work versus instance. So BibFrame is kind of, I guess, a lighter version to a certain extent of some of the RDA models. And again, I think the intent of that is so that it can be used with RDA, but also with other standards. And when it comes to talking about RDA and BibFrame, I think there's kind of a question of which has to come first, the chicken or the egg, or, you know, in this time of flux that we're in when it comes to cataloging, which was really the smarter one to change first, the cataloging standards or the cataloging rules, or the encoding standards? And it kind of, you know, had to be that one had to go first, and so RDA did. But I feel like the real changes in RDA, other than superficial things like spelling out words instead of abbreviating things, or, you know, things like that, I feel like they won't be fully realized until BibFrame or something that's not MARC comes along. Here is a quote from a blog post from 2013, or an article from In the Library with the Lead Pipe. And Jason W. Dean wrote, the change in rules for metadata creation represented by RDA will also help library metadata to be more useful, and meaning more useful to the wider World Wide Web, I suppose, and other sources of information, though perhaps to a lesser extent than BibFrame. So it's his opinion RDA is not as big of a change as BibFrame. I think, honestly, both changes are necessary, and one couldn't happen without the other, and so I think RDA had to, RDA went first, and that just happened to be the way it worked out. But I think that it will be interesting to see how RDA does in a new world that is beyond MARC, I think, and whether it will continue to be, the main standard, or whether a bunch of different standards will flourish in a BibFrame world. So we've talked kind of about the theory and the model of BibFrame. But if you're like me, a lot of it may not make sense until you kind of look at maybe some more practical applications of BibFrame. There are a number of resources.org. They have use cases where they kind of set up different cases in which you might want to use them. Let me see. Then they'll say things like, this is how we could see you using BibFrame to create a new record from scratch, or to add an instance to the existing work, or things, just kind of translating everyday cataloging work that we do now into what it might look like in a BibFrame environment. And so that is, I think, a useful resource for wrapping your head around this. They also have some demonstrations where you can kind of see BibFrame records. I don't know, it's a hard word to forget using records, even though I guess we're really thinking more about data, but you can see what a BibFrame record, for lack of a better word, would look like. And what I think is the most useful on the BibFrame.org, which again, remember, is the Library of Congress's BibFrame site, is the tools section, where you can do what they call a comparison service, where you can put in the identification number for a record in the Library of Congress catalog, and it will show you what it looks like in BibFrame, encoded in, I think you can choose a few different standards, I think. XML for sure, there might be other options, I think, but so it would be a linked data type of encoding of a MARC record. The transformation service is where you can do that transformation with your own local data. You can upload a batch of MARC records, and you can get it transformed into BibFrame records or data. And then they also have an editor where you can kind of start from scratch and build a BibFrame record. Actually, let me jump out to that editor really quick, because I think that's interesting to see. They have one that you can actually download onto your own computer. They also have the demonstration one. That is the one that I've played around with the most. And this is sort of, for me, this was pretty useful because you can read all the theory of BibFrame all you want, but for me, it still took me a while to sort of get the idea of, okay, but what are we going to be doing as catalogers? What is a screen going to look like? And so you can choose kind of what you want to work with. There's a monograph, for example, over here, and then you can choose if you're creating just a work and an instance, or just an instance. And so I'll go with a work and an instance, pretend we're creating something from scratch here. Let's see. And it's being a little bit slow here. Oh, there it goes. Okay, of course, every time you want to do a live demo, you always kind of cross your fingers. But as you can see, it's just, it gives you, it has the RDA terminology, so you're definitely working with RDA rules here. The ones that appear just as buttons, those are elements that would need authority work, I suppose. And then the transcribed elements are ones that you just type into text box. And you can see it has the work elements up here. And it does go with the RDA terminology, work, expression, manifestation, and item. And so, compared to what we do now, where we have to stare at MARC tags and know what a 245 field means, this actually, could be a lot easier for catalogers. While I'm talking about these, I didn't put this in my slides, but Zafira has their own BibFrame editor as well, and they call it Zafira Scribe. So if you Google Zafira Scribe, and Zafira is Z-E-P-H-E-I-R-A, and you'll get a link to their BibFrame editor. So if you want to play around and see which one you think is more user-friendly, that is definitely another option as well. You know, right now we're all just kind of in the phase where we're playing around with BibFrame and seeing what we can learn. And so they have a number of profiles that you can choose down here. So if you wanted to choose a print book, and it has the same sort of thing. It has fields where if some fields, the ones that say type to search in the box, like the author, it will link up to authority files. As you see, as I'm typing in Jane Austen's name, and so it will link up to, in this case, the Virtual International Authority file, VIAF, and that would link that into an authority record, and it will give me the URI for that authority record, the Uniform Resource Identifier. Whereas, again, things with title are ones where you can transcribe and you can just type them in. And you'll see that it's quite a long page. Things, again, we're breaking down things into smaller pieces of data than we did in our MARC records. So to a certain extent, when you see all the work and instance properties on the same page, they look like very, very long records, I think. So those are two BibFrame editors that you can use to play around with if you want to try your hand at creating MARC or BibFrame records. And I believe they do both have download options where you can save what you have worked on. I did also want to kind of point you in the direction of some libraries who are experimenting with BibFrame. So you can look around and look at their projects and see what they've been doing. There were a group of BibFrame early experimenters working with the Library of Congress. You can see some other national libraries. OCLC has been doing a lot of BibFrame and linked data experimentation, and so that's kind of one group of experimenters. Colorado College and University of Denver have done some experimenting, and they've documented theirs in a article in the journal Code for Lib journal, which I have the link to there. Zafira is definitely still working towards getting the libraries on board with BibFrame, and they have an initiative they call the Libhub Initiative. They have been working with libraries to convert their data to a linked data format. The Denver Public Library is one library that I know off the top of my head who's been working with Zafira on the Libhub, and so that would be something to explore if you're interested in looking at what libraries are doing with BibFrame. And there is a project called BibFlow out of University of California, Davis. They've been working with Zafira, and they have been working on getting their data in a linked data format too. So that's another thing that you could look into if you're looking for sort of pilot projects that are working with BibFrame and linked data. So to finish up here before we leave time for questions, which I definitely want to allow plenty of time for, what is next? What exactly are we heading towards here? There's a lot of interesting stuff going on with BibFrame, but what exactly does it all mean? Anytime I gave a presentation like this, usually one of the first questions asked is, so what's the timeline on this? When are we going to stop using MARC and move on to BibFrame? And my short answer is I don't know. I think it'll still be a while. The Library of Congress is this fall started kind of their pilot project with getting their own catalogers working with creating BibFrame data. Just because of the sheer amount of legacy MARC data, I think it'll be a long-ish time, I guess, before we fully totally get rid of MARC. My own personal statement I always give, and don't necessarily hold me to it, is there'll be at least 5 years before MARC is totally or mostly a thing of the past. I think we're kind of maybe at the point where we were with RDA for a while, honestly, where libraries were waiting to see what the vendors do and vendors are waiting to see what the libraries do. And but there are a number of vendor ILS companies who are partnering with Zafira on the Libhub Initiative. I know Circe Dynix is doing some work with converting their library's data to linked data. I was just at a conference where I heard something about their program. I think it's called Blue Cloud Visibility. And so I know that III has partnered with Libhub as well, so I wouldn't be surprised if they are rolling out some linked data things for their customers soon. So I think we're starting to see the tipping point a little bit as far as vendors go. So, but I do not feel like I can give a hard and fast, and I don't think people even at the Library of Congress or Zafira or anybody can give you a hard and fast timeline on when this will be the new normal for libraries. And I guess the other concern that I hear and that I have is how will catalogers' jobs change in a linked data and BibFrame environment? And I like this quote from someone from the French National Library, the BNF, in a NISO publication. And again, it's a little bit older, a couple of years old, but I think it still holds true. They say, I believe we will certainly need to change most of our cataloging habits and standards and tools, but that losing the quality and the granularity of the data itself should not be a requirement. And I think that's really true. I think, you know, what libraries are doing, creating good quality information and creating information that adheres to standards and things like authority control, I think that's really, really useful in a linked data environment where the idea is to highlight relationships between things and use standard vocabulary for things. Those are two things that are really, really valuable in the linked data world. And so I certainly do not think that catalogers and information professionals will have any diminished role in that sense. I just think it means we'll have to learn some new tools to work with, like the BibFrame editors, for example. And I think that our roles, personally, I feel that our roles may shift from being the creators of metadata exclusively to being evaluators of metadata, figuring out what other resources on the web may have data that can be linked to ours to serve our purposes. And so I do think our job will change, but I don't think it will be eliminated. And so those are my prepared remarks about BibFrame. Does anybody have any questions?
Okay. Hi, Emily. No, I have not had any questions come in during this time.
Wow.
So, yes.
So silence.
maybe everyone's feeling a little overwhelmed.
I can understand that.
Yes. So I'll just, if we can just hang out for a minute,
Sure.
we'll just put a little reminder out there that if you have a question, there's a question box in your navigation panel. To type a question to Emily, and we'll try to get to those. One person has commented. She said, "Thanks so much. Seeing the editors was very helpful."
Good. I personally think that goes a long way towards making went a long way toward making me feel like, you know, this is going to be okay. I mean, this looks like something that I can work with, and you know, if we can input this stuff and have it come out in the new standards, I think that'll be really cool.
Okay. Here's one question. Can BibFrame integrate with MARC catalogs in transitions?
That is a really good question. And I'm not sure if I have a concise answer for that. I think
we have time.
Okay, I've got about 20 minutes to answer that if I need to.
Yeah.
I think currently we're in an environment where a lot of people are exploring ways to make that happen, because I think it's going to be the question of how do we get all of our old legacy data into this new format, and I think that's what vendors are kind of starting to address. Like, I was really encouraged to hear this Circe Dynix program, because I think that what they're basically doing is sort of batch converting libraries' MARC data into linked data formats, and so I think that maybe there'll be kind of I'm sort of spitballing here, but I think that there might be a time where libraries do kind of mass convert, you know, retrospective conversion, all their data into, you know, linked data formats, and then we just kind of go from there using the new editors. I can see tools like Terry Reese's MARC edit software, if any of you are familiar with that. He has, something in place right now where it can convert AACR2 records to RDA. He calls it RDA Helper, and he's working on suites of tools for linked data type stuff. And so I think that there will be a certain amount of remediation necessary for MARC records, but I'm not sure if I'm totally answering your question, but I think that there is going to be some sort of conversion necessary, I think. I don't think there's going to be the type of thing where there's a tool necessarily that brings together your MARC data and your new BibFrame data and they work together. I feel personally, and I'm just speaking off the top of my head here, is that you'll need to have some kind of conversion done to kind of get into the new world. But I'm not sure that I am the person to speak with absolute authority on that.
Okay. All right. We did get a few more questions come in, so that's great. Keep them coming since we have time. So the next question is, how will this data display? Will it look like the editor framework? And then that's the first part of the question, then I've got a second part. So.
Okay. I would say yes, roughly it'll be pretty close. Actually, let me go back to one of the other URLs that I included, the demos page. That is probably one place that I can point to for getting an idea of what a display would look like. This is linked data browsing examples. They have MARC records. It says a collection representative of those found in a public library. And I haven't. And so this would kind of give you an idea, I suppose, of what perhaps a BibFrame display would look like. It has the work information up here, and a lot of these just have one instance, but I think that the idea would be that if you had, different editions by different publishers, they would be kind of all linked together down here in the various instance, and then you see it allows it to display by subject headings, and so I would definitely point to the demos area of the Library of Congress website, the bibframe.org website, for a possible display example.
Okay, great. Are you aware if the ILS vendors will have an open source application for the display?
That I do not know. It would be nice if they did, but I have not heard anything. As far as I know, they're also going to keep it kind of proprietary, but I cannot really answer that with any certainty.
Okay. All right, the next question is, do you think we will still be mostly copy cataloging, but within a BibFrame record? And this gentleman mostly does copy cataloging.
I would say so. I think that I think that whatever type of materials your library mostly deals with now, I think that, that will continue. There are many, many libraries out there that do mostly copy cataloging. And so I think to that extent, our role will still continue to be evaluation of data. The difference, it'll be interesting to see sort of what the OCLC of the new world is, with information being available freely out there on the web. It'll be interesting to see what sources people are drawing this information from in order to copy catalog, but I do think that yes, there will still be probably the majority of the work for a lot of libraries will be copy cataloging. Did that answer your question?
Let's see if he follows up. Yes, he said thank you. Yes, thank you. Okay. This is another question. Which ILS does Emily, are you still at the University of Nebraska?
I am, yes.
Okay, so this question is which ILS does your university use, and do you have any plans in the near future for using BibFrame or converting your legacy data to linked data?
We currently use III, Innovative Interfaces. We're on their Sierra product with Encore for our discovery layer, and no, as far as at this time, I have not been part of any discussions as far as specifically exploring linked data, although I'm interested to hear what type of services III is talking about, because I'm sure they're thinking about it with them, especially with being a partner with Zafira on the Libhub Initiative. But we do not have any plans at this time, no.
Okay. And the last question, and this is probably a good question to wrap up with, what are your suggestions to what can libraries do today to prepare for what's coming?
That's a very good question, and it is a good one to wrap up on. I think number one is just learning, doing things like attending webinars like this, making sure you don't have your head in the sand as far as, well, it'll happen someday, but maybe I'll retire before then, or something along those lines. I think just staying aware of the changes and talking to your vendors, continuing to have conversations to make sure they know that this is something that's important to you and why it's important. Let's see. I mean, it all depends on how far, what you want to do. To a certain extent, as far as preparing your data and your catalog, I would say there are some things that you can do, things that perhaps in our current system they're not fully making use of, some of the provisions of RDA, like using relationship designators in your authors' names and anything that allows for a relationship to be designated. Sometimes it can seem kind of superfluous in our current catalogs, but relationships are the building blocks of RDA and linked data and BibFrame, and so even things that maybe seem like they don't serve a whole lot of purpose, I would say, really evaluate your cataloging practices with at least one eye towards the future and what might be useful in terms of relationships or those, content type, carrier type, and media type fields that probably our ILSs don't handle the way we'd like to now, but they could be really useful for computer encoding in the future. So maybe reevaluate your cataloging processes with that. I mentioned MARC edit software before, and I recently attended a full-day workshop by Terry Reese, the creator of the software. And one thing that he pointed out was that in his, what he calls his MARC Next suite, which is sort of the linked data playing around sandbox area of MARC edit, there is a function called linking identifiers, and it will go through your MARC records and search linked data sources out there like the Library of Congress authorities available as linked data, and it will put the URIs, the Uniform Resource Identifiers, for that into, if you have anything that's an authorized heading like an author's name or a subject heading, it will put those URIs into the 100 field, next to the actual text string with the name, so it's not going to mess up your display in your catalog currently. But if you go ahead and do things like put those identifiers in your current MARC records, to me that seems like that would be kind of a step in the right direction, so that someday when the happens, all those identifiers will be there already. So there's a lot of things you could look into as pre-linked data steps to be considering.
All right. That's great. Thank you so much, Emily. I did not see any other questions come in, so if it's okay, we can wrap up a little bit early.
Okay, and if anybody has questions later, they're more than free to email me at that email address that's on the screen. I'm certainly open to that.
That's great. Thank you so much, Emily. And I'm seeing some messages, from people saying thank you as well, and that it was helpful. So,
Great.
All right. So thank you everyone for joining us, and have a good afternoon. Okay. Bye, Emily.
Bye-bye.